Welcome to Liberate Your People Pleaser. I am your host, Brenda Florida, certified life coach, and you might be a people pleaser if you sacrifice your needs or your wants or your feelings to benefit someone else, or you keep silent when something bothers you or upsets you, or you're super critical and feel like you're probably your own worst enemy. Well, here's what I've got in store for you for this podcast. First of all, there's nothing wrong with you and you don't need fixing. What we need to do is leverage the superpowers of being a people pleaser, because there are definite superpowers. You are super intuitive, I am sure. You have great powers of empathy, the ability to read a situation and know what's going on with people and those around you. So what we're going to do in each episode is talk about ways to disempower the parts of it that are diminishing and don't serve us anymore, and level up or empower all those superpowers. So join me in the next episode of Liberate Your People Pleaser. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this really special episode for me of Liberate Your People Pleaser. So as you can tell, this is the first time that I have someone joining me on the podcast. If you're watching the video, if you're in the audio, you don't know that yet. But yes, indeed, I have a guest. This is my first podcast with a guest. And I'm doing this because any of you that read my blogs know that in the last several months, I've started talking, on a regular basis about my personal and business stance of solidarity with those people who are, not white privileged, right? Everybody who is a person of color, Black, Indigenous, LBGTQ, QT, plus, all of that. Like, I just want this environment, this community of Liberate Your People Pleaser, from podcast listeners to my private Facebook group, to know without a shadow of a doubt that I'm standing in solidarity with the hardship that you experience, on a regular basis, that I have not, because I'm white, and so because I'm a white woman, I've experienced some things because I experienced, a lack of gender equality, but there's so many things that, I think for all of us have just come more into our awareness. So I have this wonderful, wonderful friend who's also a very wise woman and a coach. And we actually met in Paris, which is, of course, a wonderful way to meet someone. And so I've asked Sobia Durrani to join me today. And we're just going to have a conversation. It's very unscripted, and as all my podcasts are, but we want to have a conversation today to just sort of open this up. Of course, we want your comments, and feedback. We'll give you ways to reach out to us, or if you're seeing this on social media, put comments or do a screenshot and tag us in Instagram or Facebook or something, and we'll keep this conversation going. But I wanted to start, for those who are not watching the video, I will, Sobia, I'll let you tell us about yourself as a coach, and who you are professionally and what you do, but also then, your background and being Pakistani, and some of your story of what that's been like to you, even though you were born in the US, so I'll just, let you introduce yourself, and we'll start there.
Sounds good. I'm so excited to be here, Brenda. Thank you for having me. And yes, Brenda's a great friend of mine. We met in Paris, I think 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And I just love talking to Brenda, and I love being here on this podcast. And I just really wanted to say thank you for opening up this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And, like you said, it's just really important for us to have these conversations now.
Mm-hmm.
racism and prejudice and all of those things, they're not new, but
Right.
this year they've just been just been highlighted in such a way. And so it's definitely really important for us to have these conversations. So thank you for
Yeah.
welcoming me on your podcast.
Yeah.
So just to start, so my name is Sobia Durrani, and I am a life coach and a hypnotherapist. And I work mainly with women, and I work on just really getting to the deeply rooted subconscious beliefs that hold us back, right? So what's the cause of our beliefs, our emotions, our patterns that are holding us back? So I really work with you to liberate yourself from those things and figure out, at the root, how can we clear that from your subconscious?
Yeah. So I'm
So
going to
yeah.
interrupt you already now in your story just to say, I mean, I can't let that moment pass without saying anybody who listens to me or reads me with any regularity, I am very open about the fact that I practice what I preach, right? So if I'm going to coach other people to help them through their people pleasing patterns or, whatever's showing up in their life that is blocking them or keeping them stuck, I have to do the same. And so I talk often about, just I have coaches that I go to when I'm struggling with stuff and whatever. Well, Sobia is one of those coaches. And I've done this hypnotherapy process with her that she coaches. And it is so powerful. And for me, I use it because I can see, as soon as you said that, like I had my own little, connect the dot. One of the times that you and I had a session, Sobia, we worked on some of the real damage that I had received from the fundamentalist religious upbringing that I was in. And those messages of condemnation were so deep in me, even though like 20 years ago, I worked on them in therapy and would have thought 2 years ago, it was probably close to 2 years ago when we had our first session. I would have thought I dealt with those, like whatever, did that, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. Right. It doesn't bother me anymore. Okay. I'm past that. But then something happened in my life that triggered it. And I realized I still had some of it. And so it was such a profound release that I got from doing the work with you, because I think of the process of hypnotherapy and how deeply in our unconscious that goes. But it strikes me in our conversation today that the abusiveness, my religious upbringing was very oppressive and very abusive, which is what racism is, right? But
yes.
it's in an environment that it's culturally acceptable. The way I was treated as a child and those messages I received in the environment I was in were completely normal. Right. It was completely socially acceptable. And I think that that's been the big change this year. Not that, as you said, racism is nothing new, but I think, thank God, it started to become socially not acceptable, right? Where people are like, wait a minute, like we can't do this. We can't let other people do it. But then when you have been the recipient of it, it's a whole nother thing to start to undo those deep patterns when you've been oppressed in a certain way. So so now I'll take it back to you for how that has impacted you and some of your life and in your story.
Well, first I wanted to go back, just piggyback off what you're saying, that you're absolutely right. People have just turned a blind eye in society to all of this happening. And obviously there's still half of this country that probably wants to do that.
Yeah.
But like you said, within you individually, you had deeply rooted things that you can't spiritually bypass. You needed to go inside and look to see, well, how is what happened to me as a child still showing up for me now, right? So we had to look at the ugly, bring it up to the surface and heal it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we need to do in society, right? We need to
Yes.
bring up the ugly out of the
Yes.
shadow. I mean, it's already coming out of the shadows. Obviously, it's
Yes.
not been in the shadows. But for those people that it's like, let's just pretend this isn't happening. Let's just keep
Right.
going and be like, we can't do that.
Right.
We really need to look at it. So, it's systemic and we need to pull
Yes.
it up and heal it just like we do with ourselves individually.
Yes.
So, yeah. So I think that's a great point that you bring up. And yeah, so for me growing up, so I am the daughter of Pakistani Muslim immigrants. They moved here into Chicago in the 70s, and then I was born a year after they moved here. So I was born and raised in Illinois. And I would definitely say, like you talked about, that fear of condemnation for you was not a conscious thought. You're not walking around feeling condemned. And for me, it's the same way. The way, there was microaggressions and macro ones, right? There was both subtle and not so subtle things that happened throughout my life. But it's not like I walk around in my life thinking like I don't belong and I don't,
Mm-hmm.
I on a conscious level, I'm like, yes, I'm a strong, empowered woman.
Mm-hmm.
However, all
Yeah.
of those things that, from a child, right? I remember being in elementary school and kids just kind of taunting me like, where's the dot on your head? Shouldn't you have a dot on your head?
Oh,
And and that kind of carried through adulthood, just
right.
little things. I remember I was going for a jog in central Illinois for this project I was on, and this group of girls like roll down their window and they're like, go back to your country,
Oh my
right?
God.
And you're just minding your own business, going for a jog, and then someone just yells out like, you don't belong, right?
Yeah.
So there's all these subtle references to how you
And
don't belong
so that
and you're
astounds.
not American.
Yeah.
And
Yes, you're not American. So that astounds me also because I have this, and I'm sure other listeners can relate to this, but I have this idea that in a way that, oh, I could see that kind of thing happening in the 60s,
yeah.
right? But this must have been, I mean, you're a lot younger than I am. So like, was that in the 90s or even in the 2000s?
The go back to your country was probably in the 2000s. Yeah, I
Yeah.
would say around
Yeah.
2000. And
Yeah.
then, and then obviously I'm from a Muslim family. So there were like bigger things that
Then
happened
there's,
after 9
yeah.
11, And then in
Yeah.
this last system, with this last administration that we had. But,
Mhm.
it just kind of carries through. I think I told you a story recently where I went to a restaurant next door at the building next door. And I started to have this conversation with a woman and it started out very sweet. So she came up to me and she said, "Oh, you're so beautiful. Where are you from?" And I said, "Well, thank you." And I said, "Well, I live next door, but I'm from Chicago." And then she's like, "No, but where are you from?" And so I said, "Oh, my heritage is Pakistani." And she's like, "Oh my God." And she wanted to know all about Pakistan. So I was telling her about Pakistan, but I said, "But, I've never lived there.
Yeah.
So, I visited throughout my life, but I don't actually know how it is to live there." And, then we would continue the conversation. And then she would ask me again. I think we talked about college. And she's like, "Oh my God, what was it like to go to college in Pakistan?" And I was like, "Well, actually, again, I went to college in Illinois." And I could not get through to her. And she finally at the end she said something like, "You don't need to be embarrassed about where you're from." And at that point, I was just angry. And I'm like, I
Yeah.
am not embarrassed. I'm a proud Pakistani American woman, but you're not hearing me. I'm an American woman. I grew up in America. I
Right.
never lived in Pakistan. I'm proud of my heritage, but I've never lived there. And
Yeah.
so that's another just like reference, like you look
Yes.
different, you're different, you don't belong here.
Yes.
And one of our most primal fears is this fear of rejection,
Yeah. And the belonging. I
the
mean,
fear
to
of not belonging,
not
right?
belonging is such a powerful, I mean, it's in, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And anytime we feel like we don't belong. I have a friend the other day who was just saying, just because she's in the middle of a move and hasn't found her next place to live and whatever. And she said, I just feel like I don't belong anywhere, because she knows she has to leave one
Yeah.
house, doesn't know where she's going. And I said, well, let's just, for starters, reword that,
Right.
because belong is such a triggering word, because we're so, it's just part of our human nature to want to belong. I said, it's not that you don't belong anywhere. It's that you don't have a home. Yeah, sure. Like, we haven't identified the real estate involved, right? But
Yeah.
that's very different. And so I think in a lot of ways, there are language things that play such a part in this, that to somebody who's white, let's talk about that term white privilege, because to somebody who's white, we might use a language that is triggering, that is maybe a little unintentional, or something. But I've certainly noticed with some of my white friends, they are triggered by
Mhm.
the idea of, being called white privilege, because I think they're equating the word privilege, like it means wealth or status, or I don't know, something like that. And they're like, well, I grew up poor, or I was abused, or I had all these struggles. So I'm not white privilege. I don't have white privilege. And for me, and you can tell me your take on this, but for me, that's not it. Like, so was
Mhm.
I was abused. I mean, we weren't poor, we were kind of lower middle class, um but that's not it. It's that by nature of the fact that I am white in the US, I haven't had to worry about or receive wanted comments like, go home, go back
Mhm.
home or whatever. I haven't had to worry about being pulled over by the police and having unwarranted aggression towards me. Like, there's so much I haven't had to experience just because I'm white. That to me is what white privilege is about.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. So privilege does not mean you grew up, with this life of riches and you never had any problems, right? I recently had a discussion with a white male, and it became pretty heated because he was like, "What are you talking about? Like, I didn't," and he just, and I was like, "I'm not saying you didn't have suffering, you didn't have
Yeah.
trauma. I'm saying that race wasn't one of them. The color of your skin was not one of your issues."
Yes. Yes.
And no one, yeah. So, and for me, obviously, it's not to the extent that Black Americans have experienced and the
Mhm.
conditioning that has happened in this country towards them. But yeah, this woman, obviously, if I wasn't brown, wouldn't be
Yeah,
asking me these questions, right? Or wouldn't,
exactly.
and
Nobody's ever asked me where I'm from.
right. So, and recent, there was actually a story the other day that someone Native American was told, go back to your country, which, I mean, how
Oh my
ignorant is
God.
that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's really bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So,
yeah, go ahead.
well, so exactly, so those things kind of run in your veins, right? So if you're hearing it from the time that you're a child and you're just growing up, and to be honest, like when I go to Pakistan, it's the exact same thing. So it's like this feeling, they're like, where are you from? You're not from here. You
Okay.
might look like us, but you don't talk like us, you don't walk like us,
Yeah.
so where are you from? So that feeling of not belonging is just like, I
Yes.
don't belong there, I don't belong here, I don't belong anywhere. And
Yeah.
I just did a post about Kamala Harris because I talked about that. I said that subtle feeling of not belonging, and and now I'm so excited for women and girls to
Mm-hmm.
see the first female vice president, the first woman of color vice
Mm-hmm.
president.
Mm-hmm.
And they will have an example of representation at the highest levels of our government, and
Yeah.
that will make them feel something like maybe I belong, so they won't be conditioned in that
Yes.
system, right? So and that's really important. Representation is important. And
Yes. Yeah, let's stay with that for a second, because I don't know when this started, years ago, but whatever. I was certainly an adult. where it struck me how particularly it might have struck me first with sexual orientation, so like having a gay friend and realizing this guy never sees a romantic comedy where he's represented, right? Because they're all heterosexual
Mhm.
relationships. I mean, now we see some. Okay, so that's great, but I mean,
Yeah,
this
like
is
Schitt's
probably
Creek was so, I don't know if you saw Schitt's Creek, but I mean, that was so amazing because we saw just like a gay couple and, you know, celebrating
yeah.
their love and,
Okay, yeah, no,
but yeah,
I,
but
I
yes,
don't
we
watch
never
that.
had it
And
until now.
the thing I love now is in at least some shows, it's also just it's not something that's shown as unusual. You know, it's now like so I like I like fire and rescue and doctor shows, you know. So I started
Mhm.
watching the, you know, Chicago or Station 19. It's not Chicago, it's Seattle. It's the spinoff of Grey's Anatomy. And, you know, so there's just this guy in the fire department who's gay, and it's not like it's a big deal he's gay, right? So we're not
Mhm.
making a point out of it. He's just one of the, and so I think that's like another evolution of it, right? Is
Yeah.
that first, and I think this is part of the angst and the whole like when some people will say, well, it's not black, you know, why is it Black Lives Matter? All
Oh,
lives matter, you know, and that pisses me off too, because I think, well,
yeah.
okay, of course all lives matter, right? But there's a point at which when a group of people or a way of being, you know, comes into the light, so to speak, of like, this has to stop. Like, we have to stop normalizing this, which is, I think, what's happened. You know, if there's any silver lining to the last administration, I think that it's just shined the light on really like this has to stop. You know, like this is so ridiculous, it has to stop. But so that group or that condition deserves the spotlight of no, wait a minute. You know, of course, all lives matter. And right now, it's totally appropriate to focus our attention on this group of people who have been for so long oppressed, you know,
Yeah,
or who
it's
thought it,
Black Lives Matter too. It's not only black, it's we're
yeah,
saying Black Lives Matter too.
yeah, it's sort
And
of
you
like,
know, go to an analogy I heard is that if you go to the doctor and your knee hurts, you're not going to say like all my body parts hurt. No, it's
right.
like at that point you're highlighting my knee
My
hurts.
knee, and it deserves that. Sure, whole body health is always important, but sometimes we have to focus on a thing. You know, I mean, it's very much like even the Me Too movement, just like needed. It wasn't because sexual misconduct in the workplace or whatever was new. It's because it had been being glossed over and ignored and consciously covered up for
Yeah.
so long. It was time to put that spotlight on it and say, you know, it's time for this to come to an end. It's time for this to stop being socially acceptable, you
Right.
know. And I think that in so many ways, the LGBTQ plus community has been the, you know, maybe at the front of this, because that's had, in my mind, I don't know that this is true, I'm not a researcher, um, more attention in the last few years, you know, maybe 10 years or something. And so, but same thing, like that deserves, and now of course so much emphasis, rightly so, on folks who are transgender, and not assuming that because you look like a woman to me, you
Hmm.
express yourself as a woman, that you would consider yourself a her, right? Like,
Right.
just to stop making those assumptions, to stop assuming that because you're a brown woman and you tell me you are, your heritage, which I love, that your heritage is, you know, to from that you're Pakistani, means that that you're from there, right? Like, I have to be able to disconnect that's your heritage, and you grew up in the US just like me,
Yeah,
you know.
I'm American. I've never
Yeah.
lived anywhere else.
And so instead of assuming you're, or to always identify you as Muslim or whatever, like we just assume so many labels. And in sexual orientation and even gender, I think we're starting to see some of the undoing of um, those labels being so, assumptive towards being heterosexual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think, like you said, this year is opening up conversations to a much wider audience,
Yeah.
conversations that need to be had, and awareness that we all need to have. And just all of the blocks, like you said, the last administration, if there was a silver lining, was that it highlighted all of the prejudice and all of the racist, and like we said,
Yeah.
that that's been there
Yeah.
forever, but
Yeah.
now we're just
But now it's
talking
out in
about
the
it
light.
more,
Mhm.
right? I mean, there have been plenty of people who've been talking about it for a really long time, but I think that more of us are having these conversations is a really good thing.
Yeah.
And yeah,
So
so
what do you see um when you look to the future? And I know you have a son, and I have kids who are all grown, but I have these little grandchildren, and I love seeing how at their ages, which is 6, 7, and 10, how complete. Now of course this has a lot to do with their parents as well and the environment they're raised in, but how they don't have these assumptions, how they don't understand why, like watching a movie or something, they'll be like, Grandma B, well, like, why? We were watching Greatest Showman. I was watching it with my 6-year-old, and towards the beginning of the movie, there's a scene where he's at work and it's all men in the office. And she's
mhm,
like, Grandma B, why are there no women working there?
mhm.
Right? Like, because to her, like, that doesn't make sense. So as you look ahead to what you want for your son, some things that you think will help move us towards where we need to end up being, which obviously ultimately is equality. Imagine that. What a concept.
Mhm.
um, what do you see as some things that you really can see that need to shift, that need, and maybe in both a collective way and a personal way, that somebody in their journey who's not as far along, maybe, and particularly as a people pleaser, right? Because, and we
Mhm.
sort of skipped this, so maybe we want to step back a second from that question. And because I imagine that all of these microaggressions and various things that you experienced created a lot of the people pleasing patterns and habits that we get into for various reasons. But race, microaggressions because of race or sexual orientation or gender, uh, bias can definitely push those patterns of people pleasing. So maybe first start with how it moved you towards some of these people pleasing dynamics, and then take us into what you'd like to see for the future and how you think we can start to move the needle.
Yeah, just so yeah, the conditioning that I experienced and all of those experiences growing up definitely impacted the way I show up in the world,
Mhm.
right? So if you have a feeling of I don't belong and oh I stick out and I don't want to be rejected, the way I absorbed those messages was don't ever ruffle any feathers, make
Mhm.
sure you follow the rules, don't be too loud, don't draw any attention to yourself. So I was always the shy, quiet girl who followed the rules. And we all, many women get the message of be the good girl and be
Yeah.
quiet and be nice. And then if you're also afraid of like sticking out in some way, it's just an add, it adds to that, right? So for sure, it impacted
Yeah.
me. I was a people pleaser, never wanted to do anything wrong, never wanted to seem like I'm doing something wrong. And obviously there was more that plays into that, but as the child of immigrants, you also get it from there,
Yeah.
speaking out about the government or policy or things like that. Now I'm like, you know what? I don't care. But
Yeah.
before, I would just want to avoid any conversations about politics or anything because I just didn't want to start anything, right? And
Yeah.
now I'm like, listen, this is my opinion and
Right.
this is what it is. But it definitely impacted the way I show up in the world.
Yeah.
And now, through my own work, I'm showing up differently. And sometimes when things get bad enough, like you're just like, hey, forget all of that. I need to speak up. Thing patterns,
Yeah.
right? So for sure, I think created a people pleaser in me, and I'm still undoing that,
Yeah.
but it's really important. And so moving forward for my son, I think it's just really important for me to like instill those messages. You belong, you
Yeah.
belong just because you're here. I mean, that's something I say to my clients all the time. It doesn't matter where you come from. You belong because you were born into this world.
Yeah.
That's why you belong. You
Yeah.
belong in this world because you were born into this world. And no matter what
Yeah.
anybody says, or no matter what anybody does, like if you can carry that strength within you, then right? So Kamala she didn't have an example of someone who was a vice
Right.
president that was brown, but so she overcame a lot of stuff on her own, and she knows that she gets to have a seat at that table. And
Yeah.
even though someone before her that looked like no one before her looked like her, she
Yeah.
still belongs at that table. So I think, going forward, it's really we need to have our children know that they belong, that they're
Yeah.
valued, no matter their race, no matter their
Yeah.
sexual orientation, their gender, whatever it is. We really just need to condition our children differently.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's so beautiful. I love that you belong just because you're here, you were born. Like that is our birthright. Like I often say you're a unique expression, of
Mhm.
the divine, and there's never been and never will be anyone like you.
Mhm.
And so we each have that unique contribution,
Mhm.
to the world exactly how we are. And so if we try, and people pleasing is such a block, it's such a inhibitor
Mhm.
to authenticity. I mean, you can't have them both in the same room. Authenticity and people pleasing do not
Mhm.
live in the same room. And so we're robbing not just ourselves, but the whole world of whatever our gifts and contributions could be when we're caught in people pleasing and not living in that full expression of our uniqueness,
Yeah.
so that, like, even though you and I are both coaches, the same client could go to both of us, even talk about some of the same issues if they wanted to, right? But they would have a completely different experience, you
Yeah.
know, uh, of for their own personal growth after working with both of us. So there's no one to do what you can do. There's just no one. That if you don't do it, it doesn't get done. But I love, so I talk about that kind of thing fairly frequently, but I love this other layer of it that you're talking about here, which is really that feeling of belonging,
Yeah.
that I belong because I'm here. Nobody needs to grant it to me.
Mhm.
Nobody it is a birthright, you
Yes.
know, and we can, as equality is, and I think that one of the important things, and I'm sure you do this with people you coach too, I've really noticed, especially in the last year, as probably it's me coaching more people. It's my own evolution as a coach. I'm sure it's all the things, but I really notice how important it is that we self-validate that, right? My belonging, my uniqueness. We've been so conditioned to look for outer validation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, particularly if we're in an environment, whether it's just in my case, being a woman, or you're Black, brown, different sexual orientation, gender orientation, whatever those things are, that we've been conditioned to look to people outside of us to tell us we're okay. Right.
Yeah.
And that's part of what I admire so about everybody on this journey, is that people like trailblazers, Kamala for sure, the Obamas, back, those years ago, and a million other people who are not famous and not, whatever, they found that way to validate themselves because the outer culture wasn't validating them. And yet they took their internal validation as being more important, right? So when my internal validation is more important than the external, then there's suddenly no one who can actually make me unequal. And I mean this in a little bit of a ethereal sense. I mean, obviously a political system can create inequalities, so I don't mean to minimize that at all, but when I'm equal internally, what happens to us is we get unequal internally, right? Like being a people pleaser sets us up in a hierarchy where other people and their wants, needs, thoughts, beliefs, whatever, take priority over our own. And so the ultimate inner freedom and the ultimate liberation that both of you and I help our clients with, and you've certainly helped me with, is liberating myself. Because once I've liberated myself, then those outer environments, at least just for me, begin to start to shift. Different people show up. I'm not as driven to keep the peace and not keep my mouth shut, right? Stay silent so I don't upset that other person, right? I can find my voice, and if the other person's upset, they're upset, and that's the way that goes. It's just not, so I loved, you said it a few minutes ago about that really being able, maybe it was in the conversation with the person about white privilege, that ability to find your voice that before was silenced.
100%. Yeah. So if so I always talk about reclaim your worth. So it's reclaim because, like I said, you're born with that worth.
Yeah.
Now the system is completely broken, for Black Americans. But for people to challenge the system, and if they know their worth, and they're going to challenge the system, right?
Yes.
And so that's 100% right. So the first step is to know yourself deeply. I'm worthy. I belong. I have value. And then you're going to speak up like, this isn't right, and this isn't right, and this is what I think. And then like you said, you're not going to be so worried about pleasing the other people around you that you're not going to speak up. So change happens from already knowing you're worthy. When you already know you're worthy, you don't need to always be liked. You don't need to always have everybody agree with you. You don't, so all of those things stem from that. So I agree with you 100%. And
the other dynamic I'd love your feedback on, or your thoughts, because this has been on my mind a lot, because I'm creating a new package and a new free resource on being seen and heard. And I'm going to do another podcast on that real soon. But I think so many people don't feel seen and heard, whether it's in their romantic relationship or at work, or certainly collectively in a system like ours in the US, that could be not seeing you and not hearing you based on the color of your skin or your sexual orientation. So not being seen in the world, seen and heard by another person, like that's real, that's a real thing. And the reason why it's so fucking painful is because it points to that unworthiness piece. When people don't see and hear us, it is their way of reflecting we're not worthy of being seen and heard. And then that, like you say, gets internalized. And so one of the things that I've seen and this package I'm doing in this free resource starts with, though, is where have I not seen and heard myself?
Yes.
Because that pattern of not being seen and heard got started way before whatever's happening today, whether it's, your spouse or partner or lover or whatever, or boss or whoever. That pattern of not being seen and heard started probably in your childhood. And then we internalize it and we do it to ourselves, because every time I silence myself, because of empathy, I understand how you feel. And so now that makes how you feel more important than how I feel. That's what happens, right? We don't always think of it that consciously, but that's what's happening. Right. I get so many clients who are like, oh my gosh, I'm so empathetic and I can't this. And I'm, because they're just being ripped apart by their empathy for other people, which to me is a distortion of empathy. And in a healthy sense of empathy, I can also leave you to your own journey, even though I can see your perspective. And so when my empathy for you silences me, that's a total distortion of, what empathy is here for. And when I can see and hear myself, then I start to communicate in a way that's much clearer, and I can start to navigate and negotiate change in my external relationships,
100%.
Yeah. So what is that like for you? Like when I assume you can relate to that feeling, not being seen and heard piece.
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure. And, like I said, we all as coaches work on ourselves too, and I'm still like I said, I think I'm still working on undoing a lot of that conditioning.
Yeah.
Where I was so quiet and so like I would have no problem talking to my friends about things, but having a really large platform was really scary for me.
Yeah.
And so you're right. I have to look at myself and say, where am I still afraid to be seen and be heard? And why do I keep silencing myself? And what's the root of that? And to just have compassion for yourself. You brought up a good point that we oftentimes as empaths, which a lot of coaches I would say are, we're so worried about the other people and their feelings, and then once again we put ourselves on the back burner and we don't have strong boundaries, and we also don't have the understanding that they have their path and I have mine. And so yes, I think it's just really approaching ourselves with compassion. What are the messages we've absorbed? What are we still holding on to? And how is that impacting the way I show up in the world? And I'm still doing that work.
Yes. Yeah. Me too. I mean, I think it's a lifelong journey. I don't anticipate stopping.
I don't either.
Well, wonderful. Well, so tell folks how they can find you, because like I said, I can give you a personal testimonial, because
as I can give you
here. Oh, thank you. I mean, I think this hypnotherapy work you do is so profound. I mean, it's just a really profound, deep way to work and heal some of these things that just because I think the trap and the trick of it is it becomes so familiar to you that you think it's who you are, right? Like we can just think, I've had so many clients that are just like, well, that's how I am. I'm just a this, I'm just a that, whatever. And I've worked with them enough that I can see through that, because of course, as coaches, we can. and because it's not our, journey. And it's just that the pattern is so familiar, we identify with it and we think it's who we are, and that there's no way out, and so that's just something I have to accept, that I'm always going to be a procrastinator, that I'm always going to be judgmental, that I'm always going to be this or that, whatever. And it's not true. I'm telling you, folks, it is not true. Anything that isn't serving you can be released, can be healed. It doesn't have to be who you are. It doesn't have to define you. And that's why both of us are so passionate about what we do to help people liberate themselves from that. But so tell folks how to get in touch with you and explore the hypnotherapy work that you do.
Yeah. And like Brenda said, if you know that you have a challenge and then you define yourself by it, well, one, you're already a step ahead because you can define the challenge. And oftentimes there are people who, it's like you said, so ingrained as a part of who they are that they can't see it at all.
Yeah.
So if you can see it, you're already, ahead of the game.
Yeah.
So, the type of hypnotherapy I do is called rapid transformational therapy. And I do that along with life coaching. And you can find me on my website, and that's Sobia Durrani, SOBIADURRANI.com. You can also find me at that same name on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook. I don't use Facebook as often, but you can still find me there. I'll see the messages. But yeah, Brenda, I wanted to thank you for having me on. This is such an amazing conversation. Thank you for welcoming me, and thank you for having this conversation. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you.
Thank you. You're welcome. I am so happy to share this episode with you, and I will continue to have some guests on from time to time to keep this conversation, going, because it's time, it's just time for us to be able to have these conversations so that we can begin to tip the scale of accepting, allowing people to just be exactly how they are, and not having our own ideas about how they should be, right? That's kind of at the heart of it, that, oh, well, that makes me uncomfortable. You should be, something different. To just be able to accept all of our, unique gifts into the world, because that's a place where we can all thrive in. So
100%.
Sobia's information, I'll put that in the show notes too, for those of you who, didn't have a pad and paper or whatever, pen handy to jot that down. It'll be in the show notes so you can get it there. And again, we just welcome your comments and part of this conversation. And if you're listening and you're interested in being a guest with me on the show, and you have, a story that you feel like is relevant to this conversation, then please reach out to me, because I'm really inviting and opening up this kind of little part of my work as a place that I want to focus, a place that I want all, Black, Brown, Indigenous, LGBTQ plus, anybody who feels, you can be white, you can be a man. Anybody, there are plenty of people who feel disenfranchised, for various reasons. And I understand that and want to be part of the undoing of that, so that you can really, one by one and collectively, but of course, that's how the collective happens, right? One by one, we find that place, like you said so beautifully, Sobia, where we know we belong. And when we get there, then all the healing, has begun, and how we are able to be and show up for ourselves in the world, and the people that we attract, just it's different. It just, different things start showing up.
100%. I agree with everything you just said.
Beautiful.
And thank you for creating this space for these conversations.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Liberate Your People Pleaser. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Liberate Your People Pleaser. But don't go away just yet. I've got more for you. Right now, I have a special running on a coaching package that I put together specifically for partner pleasers. So this is how we show up in our romantic relationships. It's so important that we identify where people pleasing is silencing us, or where being overly empathetic is silencing us, how we're keeping the peace and really sacrificing our own wants and needs in our romantic relationships. So I put together this little package. I've got a special on it right now. 3 sessions. These are 1 hour, full 1 hour sessions. And the 3 sessions are only $397. That's over 30% off of a typical first package of 3 sessions for anyone working with me. This is available for people who've worked with me in the past or for new clients. And you're going to get these 3 sessions because I know in romantic relationships, a group program just doesn't cut it. Usually, you need to be with somebody you can talk about your specific problem, your specific argument that you have over and over, your specific challenge with setting a boundary or telling what you need or whatever it is. So I've designed this to be very private, one-on-one. You get 3 1-hour sessions plus a great little workbook I put together that'll help us evaluate your relationship and be better prepared for that first session. So you can get all that right now for $397. I've got the link in the show notes here. And I really hope that you'll take me up on this special offer because it's a small investment compared to the benefits it can create in your own life, your own stress levels, and the, spark in your relationship as well. So I hope you'll join me for that. Also, I'll put in the show notes my private Facebook group, Liberate Your People Pleasers, because I'd love to have you join me over there as well. There's great conversations happening over there, more social media, contact from me, and we do challenges and, there's just different free resources I put in there as well. So I put that in the show notes for you too. And last but not least, I would love to answer your question, whether it's on partner pleasing or any topic that has to do with how people pleasing might be impacting your life. So I've got a form on my website that you can fill out and submit a question. So I'll put that link in the show notes as well. And until then, I will see you on the next episode of Liberate Your People Pleaser.